Let me try to be succinct and try to kind of identify, say, buckets of kind of commentary. And like any consultant, there's kind of good news and there's not so good news. I'll try not to be wishy-washy when I actually frame my initial conversations in that way, but I think it's an appropriate way to tackle this kind of how we should think about this administration. I mean, very quickly, the highlight is things that don't worry me. I'm not particularly worried about the composition of this administration. I'm not so worried about the consistency of the members of the loose coalition that led to this administration to come in. I think the agenda is going to be a very good one. Sometimes I think the commitment of the president to this agenda, I think, is a bit underappreciated. So we should expect good things in terms of the announcements, the pension reform. I think Fabio very well put. I think I'm broadly aligned with kind of what we expect out of in terms of proposals for pension reform. Our view is that pension reform gets done, at least in the plenary of the lower house, the first half of this year. After dilutions, a little bit larger than what Fabio is kind of highlighted here, and I do believe that if you get approval of pension reform in the plenary of the lower house, I think we may get a moment at some point, first half of this year, it's like, oh my God, we're in the midst of a meaningful turning point of a shock of capitalism when you get the breadth and depths of everything that the administration is cooking up. Okay, now what is the not so good news? Not so good news is I think that the risks of this administration falling flat and disappointing in what they can get done in Congress is not small. This is the headwinds in Congress are not going to be easy to overcome. We're at the original putting at a 30% probability of not approving a constitutional reform for pension reform this year. That's not equivalent to saying not approving any pension reform over the mandate, okay? Because if you fail once, that will generate market reaction, a sense of crisis, urgency in Congress, and so that's a whole different pathway, right? But that is but that's a big nugget there, right? And number two, I think it will be a misread to say that if you get pension reform done and you guarantee 3% growth, we have more bearish views, but at least we know that a precondition for sustained growth this year depends upon and hinges on doing pension reform. If we get over that Rubicon, that now we're in a political environment where the president can deliver on the rest of the agenda, I think that's a misread. I think the political headwinds will grow over time. And the most important reason for that assessment is that this administration, more so than any other previous administration I can remember, depends on the leg of public opinion more than any other. Right? That it is the primary mechanism to be able to generate support in Congress, and our assessment is that this is going to be a tough public opinion environment to navigate, and I'll unpack a little bit why. So let me kind of unbundle a little bit the good news, and then talk through a little bit some of the challenges. Listen, why I'm not so worried about the composition and direction of this administration. I think at first cut, I think Paulo put very well, it's a pretty loose amalgam of different groups, right? You have a president who has kind of nationalistic roots with security forces. Jair Bolsonaro, when he was a federal deputy, he criticized the Real Plan. He was against privatizations of state-owned enterprises. He said former President Cardoso should be shot for having privatized state-owned enterprises. He didn't defend Temer's pension reform over the past 2 years publicly. He has a kind of coalition of social conservative platforms, a heavy element of the military rhetoric, of anti-globalist rhetoric from the foreign policy, and then you have a very good economic team, and you say, well, how does all this fit together? It seems as if that we have contradictions all over the place, right? My interpretation is a bit more constructive than that. I think that there's less dissonance within this administration than meets the eye. First, when you think about, okay, well, how can you get a president and how can you evaluate his conviction towards a liberal economic policy agenda defended by Paulo Guedes? And here, I think it's important to appreciate that the so-called conversion of the president to this agenda was slow in the making and done over the course of years, right? This was, as a candidate, when he declared his candidacy close to 4 years ago, he was meeting with liberal-minded economists on a regular basis, almost a weekly basis. He was slowly convinced of this agenda. His son brought this agenda to within the family. There was a decision in the campaign, we will embark upon a social conservative policy platform with a liberal economic agenda. After that decision was taken is when Paulo Guedes was chosen to be the economic advisor. It was not the inverse. It wasn't the case that you choose a well-respected economist in the market, and then I'll figure out whether I agree with this agenda or not. No, that wasn't the sequence. That's important, because I don't think that all hinges on the personality of Paulo Guedes, right? Number one. Number two, well, what about the military? Right? Some people in the press, well, the military is more nationalistic, they're not as heavy role of the state economy, and could that get into conflict with the economic team? Again, I don't think so. When you speak with these generals, what you really have a sensibility is that the view of the military having more interventionist role in the economy is an antiquated view of the military from the 1970s and 80s. Since then, a lot of the top brass of the military is very open and supportive of a heavy role of the private sector in regulated sectors of the economy. They're not against privatizations, with the exception of a couple crown jewels. Everything that we're hearing from the economic teams are having a very good working relationship with the military wing of the administration that controls a portfolio of energy and infrastructure. The most important and most influential advisor to the president goes by the name of General Augusto Heleno, right? Not Paulo Guedes. And so I think that the alignment of the military with this economic agenda, I think, is a good one. There's not that much daylight. You have an anti-globalist rhetoric, yes, but I think that the roots of this rhetoric and the anti-establishment wave that we saw in Brazil is very different from what we saw in the U.S. and Europe. If you look at the roots of the anti-establishment wave in the U.S. and Europe, it has a lot to do with immigration, a lower middle class that felt left behind, right? Closing borders, harkening back to an earlier era, and that gets mixed in with anti-globalist rhetoric that is to let's say, against the EU, kind of erecting trade barriers. The DNA of this administration doesn't come from that place. It was originated in an anger against the political class, and you can have anti-globalist rhetoric insofar as multilateral institutions, but it isn't inconsistent with a free trade policy orientation. So I don't see much of a, despite the fact that you have anti-globalist rhetoric, I think that people make associations with everything that entails in U.S. and Europe, but in the Brazilian case, I don't think that there is a conflict between the economic team's agenda on the one hand and the anti-globalist rhetoric on the other. And you look at the formulation of this agenda, and you speak with the economic team, this is a broad, there's a lot of excitement, a lot of a buzz. They're not only moving on, I think that the strategies and the breadth, I've already talked about in pension reform, yes, but unilateral trade, reductions in trade tariffs, fairly ambitious schedule of privatizations. I think that there is, plans for a second generation tax reform, maybe even revisiting labor reform. I mean, there is, it is a broad and deep agenda. Now, what are the challenges here that we see in terms of things that concern me? And clearly, the most important one is the relationship this administration has with Congress. And here we have a very important experiment. We have a president who set up a cabinet and delivered upon his campaign promise of choosing a cabinet without making political appointments with an eye to garner a congressional coalition in Congress, right? Because the traditional bread and butter of coalition politics in Brazil is, you have a multi-party presidential democracy, and we have 31 parties elected in the lower house this election, which will reduce a little bit. And the grand bargain is you divvy up your ministries with your allied parties, and then parties participate in access to resources from the executive office. In exchange, they deliver votes for a reform agenda to an administration, which may not be popular, but the grand bargain is worth it because the resources you get to the executive office compensate the political cost of unpopular measures, and it'll help you get reelected. Right? So Bolsonaro campaigned on a very anti-establishment platform, and he didn't do that. He nominated his cabinet without talking to any party leaders. And also there's a second leg to this, which isn't very reported in the press, which is the presidential palace is waging a silent battle against party leaders in Congress, right? Because in the old equilibrium, you had party leaders negotiating with the executive, take these ministries, these resources, and then they would be the intermediary of these resources vis-a-vis their rank and file and backbenchers, right, the Baixo Clero. And within each party, there was always ill will. The backbenchers were always of the view. These leaders, they're greedy. They hoard the resources. They give us just the crumbs that's left over, right? And there's there's an internal inequity within the parties. Onyx Lorenzoni, the chief of staff of Bolsonaro, and the president come from this backbencher crowd. They never had good relationship with their party leaders. And so their strategy to be able to get a working coalition in Congress is to try to get the baixo clero cheap. Right? What they're doing is they're going party by party and they're saying, listen, in the old regime you had 2 ministries. Now you have 22 ministries. You can have direct access. We will take care of some of your demands. We'll negotiate some appointments in 3rd and 4th tier of the administration, right? And what are they trying to do? They're trying to cut out the middleman, right? That is not going over well with these party leaders in Congress. No one is saying this publicly, right? Because you can't burn bridges with a new president that's popular. But the expressions that we're hearing in reserved conversations behind closed door is, we have our arms crossed, not bancadas in the bench watching, because we'll see, So, and the challenge here is that the margin for pension reform is pretty narrow, right? You have 140 votes, which are in the opposition today, and the opposition needs only 207 votes to block the reform. All they need is 60 plus votes from the rest of Congress to be able to stop this thing, right? So, what are our bets? Listen, I think that that you end up getting this done. The most important arm and the weapon that this government has is that you have a president that's popular, right? In a context where everyone is scared with last year's election results. You had huge renewal in Congress. Half of Congress was thrown out, right? Those who were reelected are saying, wow, I got reelected by the skin of my teeth. I had a whole bunch of money to be able to help win re-elections. It didn't have the impact I thought it was going to have, right? So even having access to resources didn't generate the electoral dividends that they thought they would. Those that got in without much money, using social media, right? And so they're all kind of shook up. And you have the president is the face of this movement. So that is a powerful tool, right? You're not going to want to burn bridges with the president, and you want to be on the wrong side of an angry public and kind of in this environment, right? And so I think that you also have an environment where you've been debating pension reform for 2 years, you socialized the diagnosis, and you found a script to sell the thing, right? Because you're using the inequities and the privileges of the public sector elite, the fat cats in the public sector, to say that you have to end those privileges to give you political cover to sell the pension reform proposal. That's all very important, right? But the key, though, I would say, is two things that we're looking at. The first is, how long will the president's approval ratings last? All right? What's the trajectory of decline of this president's approval ratings? And here I think that the most important thing to keep in mind is, what was the reason that this anti-establishment anger occurred in Brazil in last year's election to begin? Right? And a lot of the work that we did suggests, looking at public opinion polls and focus groups, is that the anger was tied to the quality of public services. You had a massive increase in the size of the middle class, families came out of poverty, and the issues that they cared about are issues like crime, healthcare, education, right? Time horizons get longer. And they associated these poor public services with corruption. That was the cocktail that led to last year's election, right? Bolsonaro surfed this anger. He was credible on corruption, credible on the issue of security. He didn't talk like a traditional politician. But the issue is, can he deliver on these issues, right? And my fear is that it's very hard to deliver on these issues, right? Because you look at who's at the front lines of delivering security, health, education. These are state governments. State governments are in fiscal crisis and collapse. The odds of us improving security, health is probably, not a very good one. And if anything, things are going to get worse on this front rather than they get better on this front. He still has some time, right? Because you're making some initiatives, the public will give him some credit. But I think there will be a frustrated expectations environment. And even if this president is successful on delivering pension reform and we head to 3% GDP growth and the optimistic forecast, I don't think that's going to translate to a popular administration. You look at all the governments that pass through an anti-establishment wave, they're all not doing particularly well from a public opinion point of view. I don't think Brazil's going to be the exception, right? So that leads me to the issues that you have to vote this quickly, right? When the iron is hot, before your honeymoon is over, right? I think the good news is that there probably will, but I'm worried about the timing of this window, and you have to sell this reform from a political communication point of view aggressively, because that's the way that you can try to convince these legislators. Because if you're not convincing legislators by giving them resources, you have to at least convince them that voting against this thing is not going to cost you too much. So the president has to come in and publicly defend this. The risk of that not happening, I say 30%. Right? I mean, so I think that's kind of where I get my number. And also, even if you're successful, I still see a declining trajectory in approval ratings, growing political headwinds, and it's not going to be an easy environment. We're going to have mixed success on that front.